Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke with U.S. President Donald Trump on the phone today, weeks after blowing past the August 1st deadline for a trade deal.
The leaders discussed current trade challenges, opportunities, and shared priorities in a new economic and security relationship between Canada and the U.S.
Throughout our negotiations with the United States on a new trade and security relationship, the objectives of Canada's new government have been constant.
What if I told you that the biggest trade war of the century might not be the victory Donald Trump claims it to be, but instead a quiet masterstroke by Canada? For months, Trump has boasted about tariffs as proof of American strength, slapping massive duties on steel, aluminum, cars, and hundreds of everyday products. On paper, he calls it a win. Billions flowing into Washington, allies forced to scramble, and a president declaring that America has finally taken control of global trade. But here's the twist. Behind the headlines, the reality looks very different. Prices inside the U.S. are spiking. Families are paying thousands more per year, and industries from farming to auto manufacturing are reeling under the pressure. Layoffs, uncertainty, and chaos are quietly eating away at the so-called victory. And north of the border? Canada, the country Trump expected to buckle under pressure, has done something shocking. Instead of rushing into a bad deal, it's holding back, playing a long game of patience, leverage, and quiet retaliation. Oil, gas, uranium, critical minerals, resources Washington cannot live without, are still flowing, but Canada now controls the terms. And while other allies like Europe and Japan bent to Trump's demands, signing costly, lopsided agreements, Canada stood firm. This isn't just a clash of tariffs, it's a test of endurance, strategy, and national resilience. Trump may have fired the first shots, but Canada has chosen to fight a different kind of war, a slow, deliberate game of economic chess that could reshape North America's future. So did Trump really win this trade war? Or is Canada setting the stage for a victory no one saw coming? After weeks of silence, something finally broke the standoff. Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump got on the phone. On the surface, it looked like a routine conversation between two leaders, but in reality, it was far from ordinary, because this was the first real contact since Trump's self-imposed August 1st deadline had passed without a deal. Trump wanted victory. He had been demanding concessions, threatening to tear up trade agreements, and using tariffs as his weapon of choice. When Canada didn't fold, he escalated, hitting metals, cars, and hundreds of other products with tariffs as high as 50%. His message to Ottawa was blunt: bend or face the consequences. But Carney's response shocked observers. Instead of panicking, instead of rushing to offer concessions, Canada's Prime Minister chose silence and patience. For weeks, Trump's threats were met with little more than calm defiance. And when the call finally came, Ottawa described the conversation as substantive and productive. Washington? They released nothing. No statement, no details. Just silence. That imbalance said everything. Trump was loud, aggressive, and desperate to show strength. Carney was measured, strategic, and careful not to reveal too much. One side played politics for headlines. The other side played chess. And here's the key. While Trump's August deadline came and went, unleashing massive tariffs, Canada still held powerful cards. The phone call wasn't just about words. It marked the beginning of a deeper game. Because behind the smiles and polite phrases, both leaders knew this wasn't over. This was only the opening move. But what exactly had Trump done to escalate the fight? And why was it already backfiring at home? If there's one thing Donald Trump is known for, it's doubling down. And when Canada refused to bend, that's exactly what he did. The White House announced something shocking. Tariffs of 50% on steel and aluminum would no longer stop at raw materials. They now covered hundreds of new products, from car parts to refrigerators, cranes to baby strollers, even the aluminum in soda cans. Think about that for a second. Everything from the car you drive, to the can of soda you drink, to the stroller you push your child in, suddenly got more expensive overnight. This wasn't just a trade dispute anymore, it was a direct hit on the everyday lives of American families. And here's the irony. Trump sold tariffs as a way to punish foreign exporters, claiming they would absorb the costs. But in reality, it was Americans who were paying the price. Grocery bills climbed. Cars became thousands of dollars more expensive. Construction projects slowed as the cost of heavy machinery soared. For Trump, the escalation was supposed to prove strength, a signal that no country, not even America's closest neighbor, could defy him. But behind the scenes, experts were already sounding alarms. Economists warned of inflation, businesses warned of layoffs, and families were bracing for higher bills. Trump had raised the stakes to the highest level possible, but in doing so, he had also created a dangerous new problem. His trade war was starting to hit home harder than it hit abroad, and the cracks in America's economy were already starting to show. The real shock of Trump's tariffs wasn't felt in Canada first. It was felt in the United States itself. Almost immediately, American companies began warning that the cost of doing business was rising at a dangerous pace. Walmart, the country's biggest retailer, openly admitted that higher prices were already flowing through supply chains. That meant everyday essentials, food, clothing, household goods, were about to hit families where it hurts most, their wallets. And the numbers painted an even darker picture. In April, researchers at Yale projected that Trump's 2025 tariff package would push up U.S. consumer prices by 2.3%. That doesn't sound like much until you realize it translates to about $3,800 in extra costs per household every single year using 2024 prices. For a middle-class family, that's the difference between saving for the future and falling behind. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco went further. By 2028, they warned, if tariffs stayed in place, U.S. real incomes could shrink by nearly 0.5%. That may seem small, but across the entire economy, it meant billions wiped away from ordinary Americans' pockets. And it wasn't just about statistics. The shock hit local communities hard. In Michigan, the Center for Automotive Research warned that Trump's proposed auto tariffs could add $18 billion in costs to the car industry in a single year. Soon after, iconic American manufacturer John Deere announced layoffs at 3 Midwestern plants. Their reason? Sales were falling, and the cost of production, thanks to tariffs, was climbing too high. This wasn't the winning Trump had promised. Economists even coined a new phrase to describe the chaos: Trumpian uncertainty. Businesses were scared to invest, afraid to hire, and hesitant to expand, because no one knew what tariff Trump might announce next. The president had promised a victory that would make America stronger. Instead, it looked like his own country was carrying the heaviest burden. But while the U.S. economy stumbled, Canada was quietly preparing its countermove, holding on to powerful leverage that Trump could not afford to ignore. While American families were watching their bills climb, Canada was sitting on a set of cards that Washington could never easily replace. Start with energy. In 2024 alone, Canada shipped nearly 4 million barrels of crude oil every single day to the United States. Add to that more than 8 billion cubic feet of natural gas daily, and you begin to see the scale of dependence. Without Canada, American homes would lose heat, gas stations would face shortages, and industries would grind to a halt. And that's only part of the picture. Roughly 27% of the uranium-fueling U.S. nuclear power plants came straight from Canada. Imagine trying to swap that overnight. It's nearly impossible. Then there are the critical minerals. Nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements, resources essential for electric vehicles, advanced weapons, and the defense supply chain. Canada controls significant reserves of these, and Washington knows it. In a world where technology and energy security are everything, Canada quietly holds a choke point. And here's the irony. Despite Trump's aggressive tariffs, about 85% of all trade between the two countries still moved duty-free under CUSMA. That gave Canadian exporters a base of stability. They were hurting, yes, but they weren't collapsing. Meanwhile, Ottawa was hitting back in a very different way. Instead of mirroring Trump's every move, Canada chose precision retaliation. In March, it slapped 25% tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods, but not just any goods. They were carefully chosen: food items, beverages, motorcycles. Everyday products tied to politically sensitive U.S. states and districts. pressure points designed to sting where it mattered most, inside Trump's own political base. It was a masterclass in subtle power. Canada didn't need to match Trump blow for blow. Instead, it reminded Washington that the two economies were so deeply connected that any attempt to crush Canada would hurt America even more. And yet, Carney and his government weren't just retaliating, they were also preparing a much bigger long-term strategy. Canada's response to Trump's trade war wasn't loud, flashy, or headline-grabbing. Instead, it was something far more dangerous to Washington: strategic patience. While Trump barked threats and celebrated short-term victories, Prime Minister Mark Carney stayed calm. He resisted calls to retaliate with equal force, refusing to escalate a fight that could spiral out of control. Instead, he focused on holding Canada's strongest cards and waiting for the right moment to play them. And here's where Canada's strategy became fascinating. At the national level, Carney directed billions in support to industries hit hardest by tariffs: lumber, agriculture, and manufacturing. These weren't random handouts. They were carefully designed lifelines to make sure Canadian businesses could survive long enough to outlast the storm. But Carney wasn't alone. On the provincial front, Ontario Premier Doug Ford took the opposite approach in tone. While Carney was measured and diplomatic, Ford was fiery, confrontational, and blunt. He openly called Trump's tariffs a hidden tax on American families and promised Canada would never roll over. Ford even launched a $70 million program to help workers and pressed Ottawa to crack down on cheap foreign steel. Two leaders. Two very different styles. Yet both working toward the same goal: protecting Canada without sacrificing its long-term position. One played the quiet game of endurance. The other rallied the public with defiance and pride. Together, they formed what became known as Team Canada. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a strategy. Provinces, unions, industries, and policymakers all began aligning under one message: Canada would not be bullied into a bad deal. And this unity gave Canada something Trump didn't expect: resilience. While other countries rushed to sign painful agreements with Washington, Canada stood firm, absorbing targeted damage in the short term but preserving its long-term leverage. But this approach would be tested when the world saw what happened to America's other allies, the ones that caved to Trump's demands. While Canada held its ground, other U.S. allies faced a very different fate, and the contrast couldn't have been clearer. In Europe, Japan, and South Korea, leaders scrambled to meet Trump's August 1st deadline. They believed that signing quick agreements, locking tariffs at around 10 to 15% in exchange for massive investment pledges, would bring stability. On paper, it sounded like a compromise. In reality, it became a trap. Take Japan. Its auto sector, one of the largest in the world, suddenly faced billions in new costs. Mazda alone warned of nearly $1 billion in extra expenses this year. To cope, they poured money into a new $2 billion factory in Alabama, hoping U.S. production could shield them. But here's the catch. Half of Mazda's cars for the American market were still made in Japan, and tariffs kept hammering them. Even with new investments, uncertainty ruled the day. Europe's metal industry fared no better. Brussels announced a framework agreement with Washington, promising tariff relief through quotas. But the reality was brutal. Steel and aluminum still faced a crushing 50% duty. The quota system wasn't even clearly defined. European steel producers, already struggling with falling demand, warned that U.S. tariffs had wiped out billions from an industry worth over $90 billion a year. Their message was simple: they had signed under pressure, and the pain hadn't gone away. This is the trap Trump set. Countries that signed quickly got no real relief, just vague promises, ongoing costs, and an unpredictable White House that could change the rules overnight. And that's where Canada's patience looked brilliant. By refusing to sign, it did face heavy tariffs, 35% on goods outside CUSMA, but because most Canadian exports were still protected, the effective rate averaged just 5–6%. Painful, yes, but far less devastating than what Europe and Japan had locked themselves into. In other words, Canada sacrificed short-term comfort for long-term strength. Allies that rushed to appease Trump got stuck with crippling commitments and lost leverage. Canada, by waiting, kept its options open. It wasn't just survival, it was strategy. And that strategy would soon grow into something even bigger, a national movement of resilience and unity that became known as Team Canada. By late summer, Canada's strategy was no longer just about fending off tariffs. It had transformed into something bigger, a national movement of unity and resilience that came to be called Team Canada. Standing side by side in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford sent a clear message to both Canadians and Americans. Canada would not be bullied, and it would not fold. Carney's tone was measured, focused on building long-term competitiveness. He spoke of investing in housing, infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and the auto and steel industries. His message was calm but firm. Canada must strengthen itself from within, making sure it never depended entirely on Washington's decisions again. Ford, on the other hand, played the firebrand. He didn't mince words. He called Trump unpredictable, even saying no one could guess what the president might announce tomorrow morning. His solution? Make Canada the most competitive place to invest, cutting taxes, reducing red tape, and keeping production at home. And here's the striking part. Despite the tariffs, Ontario recorded nearly $40 billion in foreign investment in 2024, creating 25,000 jobs. While Trump tried to squeeze Canada, global investors were still betting on its future. That sent a powerful signal. Canada wasn't crumbling. It was adapting. Behind the headlines, both federal and provincial governments rolled out billions in support. Ontario launched a $1.5 billion financing program for businesses hurt by U.S. tariffs and invested another $2.5 billion in skills training so workers could move into new opportunities. A $500 million fund was created to process critical minerals domestically, ensuring Canada wasn't just exporting raw materials but also keeping the value chain at home. And this wasn't limited to Ontario. Across the country, provinces and the federal government signed new internal trade agreements, removing barriers between Canadian provinces. Analysts projected this could add over $200 billion to Canada's economy in the coming years. In other words, Trump's tariffs, designed to weaken Canada, were actually fueling a wave of transformation at home. Carney and Ford, though different in style, hammered the same message. Canada would not become America's 51st state. The trade war was painful, yes, but it was also pushing Canada to become stronger, more united, and more competitive than ever before. This wasn't just survival, it was reinvention. And that raised the ultimate question. In this so-called trade war, who was really winning? Trump or the country he was trying to break? Donald Trump promised a victory. He declared his tariffs proof of American strength, pointing to the billions flowing into Washington as a badge of honor. But behind the curtain, that victory looked very different. In the United States, families were paying thousands more per year. Groceries, cars, household goods, all climbing in price. Iconic companies were laying off workers. Economists warned of shrinking incomes and declining investment. What was sold as a bold triumph was, in reality, a hidden tax on the very people Trump had vowed to protect. Meanwhile, Canada, the supposed underdog, refused to break. Prime Minister Mark Carney's patience, paired with Doug Ford's fiery defiance, created a unified front that Washington couldn't ignore. Instead of rushing into a lopsided deal, Canada absorbed the short-term pain, invested billions into its own industries, and turned crisis into opportunity. Tariffs meant to weaken Canada had, in many ways, forced it to grow stronger. And when you compare Canada's endurance with the fate of America's other allies, Japan, Europe, South Korea, the contrast is startling. Those nations rushed to appease Trump, locking themselves into costly promises and punishing tariffs. Canada, by waiting, kept its leverage alive. It didn't mortgage its future for quick relief. So who really won this trade war? On the surface, Trump got his headlines. But history won't remember the press releases. It will remember the reality. Rising prices at home, chaos in American industries, and a neighbor to the north that refused to bow down. This wasn't just about tariffs. It was about endurance, strategy, vision. Trump may have fired the first shots, but Canada turned the fight into a test of patience. And in doing so, it may have set the stage for the real victory. Because when the dust settles, it won't be the loudest voice that wins. It will be the country that stayed calm, stood firm, and quietly built the future on its own terms. And in this clash, Canada may have done exactly that.